The following podcast contains discussions of child abuse, racism, suicide, and mental illness. Also, spoilers. Lots of spoilers. Ready? Let's dig in. Her first reaction was shock. The second, anger. She had known something was wrong when she stepped into the room. The woman's voice had been strange. Her body anxious, like she was trying to hide her face. She had thought it was Grace again, playing her troubling games. She didn't think there would be another player. She didn't think it would be him. That he would put on this disguise, this dress, blacken his face and plan this elaborate masquerade. And for what? To read her palm? Her skull? To know her feelings? The dangerous thought of it leaped into her chest, and her third reaction was hope. Ah, romance. Ladies, find yourself a man who disguises himself as a fortune teller to trick you into saying you're in love with him. Or better yet, don't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Hi, I'm Gabby, and this is Digestibles, a podcast about all the books you were told to read but probably didn't. And today, we're going to talk about Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte wrote what was probably the 50 Shades of Grey of its time. We have a young, innocent heroine, her brooding boss, enough sexual tension to burn the pages, and even a red room. When Jane Eyre was published in 1847 under the pen name Currer Bell, it was an instant bestseller. People could not get enough of it. It hit a lot of good spots. It was gothic romance, a coming-of-age story, and also contained a lot of social commentary. Plus, it was a naughty, naughty book. Critics would call it crude and immoral. Part of it is because Jane, as a heroine, is ahead of her time. She's smart, sassy, and scandalously unwilling to live under anyone else's terms but hers. Life tried to hold her down, but Jane Eyre would endure both on the page and in history. Proof that you just can't keep a good girl down. Jane's life sucks. She's 10 years old, her parents are dead, and she's living with her aunt who hates her for no reason. Mrs. Reed has a son, John, who's an awful, spoiled bully. We meet him when he finds Jane in her favorite hiding place, grabs the book she's reading right out of her hands, and throws it at her hard enough that she falls down and hits her head. On the fight-or-flight response, Jane is more of a fighter. John can dish it, but he can't take it. So when Mrs. Reed breaks them up, Jane is punished for hurting John. She's then sent to the Red Room. Yes, like the infamous playroom in 50 Shades. Only, less play, more pray you can get out. It's an interior designer's nightmare. Everything is red. The curtains, the carpet, furniture, yeesh. It also happens to be the room where Jane's uncle died. She thinks it's haunted. Being locked up in a room with a ghost, even an imaginary one, is not good for one's mental health. After a while, Jane starts screaming. Servants rush in to help, but this annoys Mrs. Reed, so it only earns Jane a longer timeout. She eventually passes out from the fear and the stress. I mean, who wouldn't? The next day, a pharmacist comes to visit to check on Jane. He asks her why she's so miserable, and Jane's like, "I'm surrounded by assholes. Oh, and there's a ghost too." He ignores that. Later, he asks if she'd like to go to school, and Jane says, "Yes, please, anything to get away from these people." But before he leaves, he mutters something about her nerves not being in good shape, which might as well be Victorian doctor speak for you cray-cray girl. Fast forward a few months later, and a tall man in black comes to visit. He's the headmaster of Lowood, a charity boarding school. Kinda like Hogwarts, but without magic and for poor people. Mr. Brocklehurst is also the opposite of Dumbledore. He's grim and nasty and thinks it's his job to discipline wicked children. Mrs. Reed says, well, that's perfect because Jane's a bad little liar. Mr. Brocklehurst asks Jane if she knows where naughty girls go when they die. To hell, Jane says. And what must she do to avoid going there? He continues. Jane answers, I'll keep being healthy and not die. Sassy, I like her. After he goes, Jane confronts her aunt. She's angry because Mrs. Reed called her a liar and decides it's time to drop some truth bombs.
am not deceitful. If I were, I should say I loved you. But I declare I do not love you. I dislike you the worst of anybody in the world except John Reed. And this book about the liar? You may give it to your girl Georgiana, for it is she who tells lies, and not I. I am glad you are no relation of mine. I will never call you aunt again as long as I live. I will never come to see you when I am grown up. And if anyone asks me how I liked you and how you treated me, I will say the very thought of you makes me sick, and that you treated me with miserable cruelty. People think you a good woman, but you are bad, hard-hearted. You are deceitful.
Mic drop. Whew. Let's fast forward again. Jane is now in school, and of course it sucks. The students wake up before dawn every day to study math and the Bible. The food is disgusting and sparse, not to mention everyone wears ugly brown dresses. But Jane's happy. Uh-oh. She's made a friend. Her name is Helen Burns, and she's good and kind and practically perfect. And she has a cough. Double uh-oh. If you've read enough classic literature, you would know that whenever a character starts coughing, they're probably not going to last very long. Winter turns to spring, and a lot of girls suddenly get sick with typhus fever. Helen does not have typhus, but she does have consumption, or tuberculosis as we call it now. She's literally too pure to keep existing. Jane sneaks into her sickbed to keep her company. They have a tear-jerking conversation about God and death, and then fall asleep in each other's arms. When Jane wakes up, Helen is dead. Because Jane can't ever have nice things in her life. Time jump once again. Jane is now 18 years old. She's a teacher, and things actually improved in Lowood after the typhus outbreak. But Jane isn't happy. She wants adventure in the great wide somewhere, so she secretly advertises herself as a tutor or governess. A week later, she gets a letter from a Mrs. Fairfax. Jane's so excited to leave that she barely asks any questions about the job. Off Jane goes to a place called Thornfield Hall. She learns that the owner of the house is Mr. Edward Rochester. Mrs. Fairfax is his housekeeper, while her student is Mr. Rochester's ward. Adele is French and barely speaks English. She's less than 10 years old and constantly tries to act like an adult. She says Rochester took her in after her mother dies, but she rarely sees him because he's always traveling. Mrs. Fairfax shows Jane around the mansion. It's beautiful but slightly creepy, with long dark corridors and a lot of empty rooms. While they're headed back from the attic, Jane hears an eerie laugh. Mrs. Fairfax says it's just a servant named Grace Poole. Time jump again. And 3 months pass. Jane's life is better, but she still feels trapped. One day, she gives Adele a break and goes on a walk to the town. She stops on a lane while a horse and its rider are galloping down, accompanied by a great big dog. As they pass her, the horse slips on a patch of ice and they fall down. Jane hurries to help. The man accuses Jane of casting a spell on his horse. He's dark and stern, in his late 30s. She lets him lean on her while he mounts his horse. Then, he rides away. Later, when Jane returns to the house, she sees the same dog and asks a servant who owns him. The answer? Mr. Rochester, the master of the house. Rochester invites Jane and Adele for tea and asks Jane a lot of personal questions. It's almost as if he's flirting, which makes Mrs. Fairfax uncomfortable. It's inappropriate for this awkward job interview that's months too late. In the coming days, Jane would rarely see him, and when she does, he's moody. Mrs. Fairfax explains that Thornfield has so many bad memories for him, which is why he rarely stays around. Can't blame you, man. I do the same. One night, Rochester sends for Jane and Adele to come to him after dinner. He distracts Adele with a box of presents and orders Jane to sit close to him. Can somebody call HR? Jane is staring at Rochester, so he asks her if she thinks he's handsome. Jane says, no, he isn't. She apologizes, but Rochester doesn't mind. He likes her honesty. They talk about stuff, mostly his character, and he says, sorry not sorry. He used to be nice when he was younger, but now he's extra suspicious. It comes with age and experience. Jane claps back that just because he's older, it doesn't make his opinions any better. They debate about it for a while until Jane gives up and says she has to put Adele to bed. So, Rochester's known for being this dark, brooding hero. You know the type. Strong and silent with a mysterious past. He's rough and rude, but deep inside, he has a heart of gold. Like, Edward Cullen, but less sparkly vampire. And don't get me wrong, Rochester's all that, but he's also super chatty. He and Jane have very long conversations throughout the book, and it's mostly Rochester asking her nosy questions about her life, mansplaining about the big bad world, or vague booking about his secrets. One day, he finally explains his relationship with Celine, Adele's mother. She was an opera dancer, and he was her protector/sugar daddy. He thought she loved him too, but he finds out she was cheating on him the whole time, so he throws her out. Celine says he's Adele's father, but he doesn't believe her. And as DNA tests didn't exist then, there's no way to prove it. When Celine abandons Adele for a boyfriend, Rochester feels so sorry for the kid and brings her back to England with him. This sob story works on Jane, and that night, she's thinking about Rochester and how much he trusts her and how he already feels like family to her. She doesn't ever want to leave him. Her thoughts are interrupted when she hears a faint noise above her. The hushed sound seems to be traveling closer and closer to her room.
This was a demoniac laugh. Low, suppressed, and deep. Uttered, as it seemed, at the very keyhole of my chamber door. The head of my bed was near the door, and I thought at first the goblin laughter stood at my bedside, or rather, crouched by my pillow. But I rose, looked round, and could see nothing. While as I still gazed, the unnatural sound was reiterated, and I knew it came from behind the panels. My first impulse was to rise and fasten the bolt. My next, again to cry out, "Who is there?" Something gurgled and moaned. Eyre-long steps retreated up the gallery towards the third-story staircase. A door had lately been made to shut in that staircase. I heard it open and close, and all was still.
Jane opens her door and sees a candle in the hallway. There's smoke in the air. Something is burning. She looks around and the door to Mr. Rochester's room is ajar with even more smoke coming out of it. She runs inside and sees the bed and curtains on fire. Rochester asleep in the middle of it. She tries to shake him awake. When it doesn't work, she grabs a basin of water and throws it at him. He gets up swearing. Once they put out the fire, Jane tells him about the creepy laugh she heard. Rochester doesn't seem surprised. He tells her to stay in the room while he deals with it. When he finally returns, he says it's exactly what he thought, shrugs it off as Grace Poole being a weirdo, and tells Jane to say nothing about the incident. Jane starts to leave, but Rochester stops her. He takes her hand and won't let go. He wants to say something, but just stands there holding her hand. HR? Mrs. Fairfax? Anyone? Jane convinces him that she has to leave before the servants find her in his room, so he releases her. Jane goes back to bed, but she can't sleep. In the morning, Jane is disturbed when she sees Grace Poole. Rochester didn't fire her? So Jane decides this would be a good time to talk to her. Grace just warns her to keep her door locked every night. Is that a threat? Rochester's also ghosting Jane now. She finds out later from Mrs. Fairfax that he left to stay with some friends nearby. One of them is Blanche Ingram, the local beauty. Jane thinks Rochester is going to marry her, but Mrs. Fairfax thinks Blanche, at 25, is too young for a guy pushing 40. Finally, someone in this house with a bit of sense. Jane's kicking herself for getting a crush on her boss. To punish herself, she spends the next 2 weeks drawing an imaginary Blanche so she can always remember how ugly and plain she is in comparison. Wow, the effort. She's so miserable, she's even thinking about quitting when Mrs. Fairfax receives a letter from Rochester saying he's moving the party over to Thornfield. Rochester and his guests arrive, including the beautiful Blanche. There are 8 women and 6 men in total, but no one else is important, so I won't bother you with their names. Rochester orders Jane and Adele to join them after dinner. Up close, Blanche is even prettier, but also kinda mean. Think of a Regina George in a corset and petticoats. Adele loves the attention, but Jane keeps her distance. She keeps staring at Rochester and realizes she's in love with him. Sadly, he's too busy flirting with Blanche. One day, Rochester is away on business and a stranger arrives. His name is Mason, and he says he met Rochester in Jamaica. Another stranger comes knocking. It's an old woman who offers to predict the fortunes of the young single women in the house. Blanche wants to go first, but she comes out grumpy and calls the woman a fake. The rest of the ladies are happier with their fortunes and are amazed by all the intimate things the woman knows. The fortune teller insists that there's another single woman she hasn't seen yet. They look at Jane. Jane doesn't believe in all that nonsense, but she goes anyway. A strange woman is hunched in a chair by the fireplace. Her skin is dark, her face half covered by her hat and scarf. The woman tries to goad Jane with some personal info and keeps bringing up Mr. Rochester for some reason and, whatever, it's Rochester. The fortune teller is Rochester, who just wants to mess around with everyone. Jane is obviously upset and tries to leave. Rochester gets her to stay and she tells him about their new visitor. Rochester looks ill when she says Mason's name. He asks Jane to fetch him. After, Jane goes to bed, but another noise disturbs her sleep.
The night, its silence, its rest, was rent in twain by a savage, a sharp, a shrilly sound that ran from end to end of Thornfield Hall. My pulse stopped. My heart stood still. My stretched arm was paralyzed. The cry died and was not renewed. It came out of the 3rd story, for it passed overhead. And overhead, yes, in the room just above my chamber ceiling, I now heard a struggle, a deadly one it seemed from the noise, and a half-smothered voice shouted, "Help! Help! Help!" 3 times rapidly.
The guests wake up and stumble around in confusion. Rochester appears and explains that a servant just had a nightmare, so they can all go back to bed. Jane knows something's up, so she gets dressed and she waits. Sure enough, an hour later, Mr. Rochester knocks at her door and asks her to come with him. They go up to the 3rd floor, and as they enter, Jane hears the weird laugh again. Mr. Rochester leads her to a room where Mr. Mason is unconscious on a chair. One of his arms is soaked with blood. They try to patch him up, but he keeps bleeding. Rochester leaves to get a doctor, locking the door behind him. While waiting, Jane hears creepy stuff like snarling sounds, almost like a dog fighting. When the doctor arrives, he notices that Mason wasn't stabbed, but bitten. What the F is in this attic? They help Mason sneak out of the house. Before he's driven away, he asks Rochester to take care of, her. Rochester and Jane are left alone and they take a walk. He goes, "What if a young man made a terrible mistake and then spends the next 20 years trying to forget the consequences? One day, he unexpectedly meets someone who makes him want to be a better man, but he needs to break a sort of law to be with them. Would that be okay? Asking for a friend. Jane's advice: your friend's redemption arc should never depend on another person. He needs to fix himself first. Rochester's all, thanks, I hate it. Then he changes the topic, hinting that he's going to marry Blanche because she's just, great. Jane is having recurring nightmares about a ghost baby. She thinks it's an omen that something bad is about to happen. After about a week, she gets a visit from one of her aunt's servants. He tells her that John Reed is dead and that Mrs. Reed has had a stroke. She's asking for Jane. Jane immediately goes to Rochester to ask for time off. He makes her explain everything and doesn't understand why she wants to waste her time on someone who was so horrible to her. He also realizes that he hasn't even paid her for her work yet, and they kinda flirt about it, I guess. Girl, if my boss didn't pay me for 6 months, I'd be the opposite of trying to be cute. Anyway, Jane gets her revenge by saying she'll be advertising for another governess job now that he's marrying Blanche. Jane goes to her aunt's house. Her aunt is in and out of consciousness a lot, so Jane doesn't get to talk to her properly until days later. A lucid Mrs. Reed apologizes to Jane for treating her badly and confesses a secret sin. 3 years ago, Jane had an uncle asking after her. He wanted to find Jane so he could write her into his will. Mrs. Reed wrote to him that Jane died during the typhus epidemic at her school. What a piece of shit! Jane forgives her aunt, and that night, she dies. After several weeks, Jane returns to Thornfield and meets Rochester along the way. He scolds her for being gone a whole month. Impulsively, Jane says wherever he is her home, and then quickly walks away before Rochester can react. Very smooth. Spring turns to summer, and one day, Rochester invites Jane out for a walk. He announces he's found a new job for her and she can leave as soon as he marries Blanche. Jane is distressed and tries to hide it, but Rochester keeps pushing her buttons, asking her if she'll miss Thornfield, aka him. Jane cries out that she has exactly as much heart and soul and feelings as him, and that they're equals. Rochester agrees and kisses her. Whoa! Jane is confused, calls him a married man, and asserts she's leaving. She also says that famous quote that's embroidered in every feminist's pillow.
I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will, which I now exert to leave you.
You go, girl! But before she can sashay away, Rochester says, psych! He's just kidding about Blanche, but he does want to marry Jane. Ladies, find yourself a man who plays stupid games like pretending he's getting married to someone else to make you jealous, then kisses you, then while you're suffering from the emotional whiplash, thinks now's the perfect time to propose. Please don't do that. Anyway, Rochester convinces her that he's serious, and so Jane agrees to marry him. Rochester asks God to forgive him. I wonder why. I think this is the best time to insert a gentle reminder that Jane is 18 and Rochester is in his late 30s. Let that sink in a little bit. Jane is happy again. Somehow, she hasn't been conditioned to be suspicious about it yet. Fast forward to the night before the wedding, Jane tells Rochester she's anxious because yesterday, she woke up in the middle of the night and there was a stranger in her room. A woman, large and tall with thick dark hair, wearing a long white dress and Jane's wedding veil. Jane describes her face as savage with red eyes, wild black eyebrows, and purple lips, like a vampire. The woman tore the veil in two and stomped on it. She looked at Jane and, for the second time in her life, Jane fainted. Rochester tells her it was probably just a dream. Jane says it can't be because the wedding veil is in pieces. Next, he says it's just Grace Poole and her nerves were making her see things differently. Jane thinks, sure, Jan, but she pretends to be okay. In the morning, Rochester is impatient to get to the church. He practically drags Jane to it. The ceremony begins, and you know the bit where anyone can speak up or forever hold their peace? Well, turns out someone couldn't hold their peace. Dun dun dun! Rochester can't marry Jane because he's already married to someone else. The one who speaks up is a lawyer to Mason. Remember him? 15 years ago, Rochester married his sister, Bertha Mason, and that he has the marriage certificate to prove it. Mason then reveals himself and says he saw his sister alive at Thornfield just 3 months ago. Rochester tries to deny it at first, but eventually admits that it's all true, but he has a very good reason. He invites everybody to come back to Thornfield and meet his wife. They all go up to the attic at Thornfield and he shows them Bertha. She's acting like a wild animal and tries to bite Rochester. He and Grace Poole manage to tie her to a chair. He asks everyone if they can blame him for wanting to marry someone else like Jane instead. I mean, cool motive. Still bigamy, but cool. Rochester tries to convince Jane to run away with him. They can pretend to be married in practice if not on paper. Jane refuses because she will not live a lie. He explains that his father arranged this marriage and he agreed because Bertha was beautiful and rich and seemed like an okay person. He finds out too late that madness runs in the family. Bertha's mother is in an asylum and her 2 other brothers have mental problems as well. He stays with her for 4 years even though he feels like he's been tricked. When his father and older brother die and he inherits everything, he thinks about getting a divorce. But it's not allowed because, the vows say in sickness and in health. So, he dumps Bertha in Thornfield, hires Grace Poole, and escapes to Europe where he gets depressed, drinks a lot, and hoes it up a bit. When he meets Jane, he's immediately attracted to her and is really truly in love with her. That night, Jane dreams of a spirit warning her to flee temptation. So the next morning, she wakes up early, leaves Thornfield, and rides the first coach out of there, no matter where it's going. In just 2 days, Jane's money runs out and then she's dropped off in the middle of nowhere. She walks to the nearest town. By the time she gets there, she's dehydrated and starving. She asks around for work but can't find any. She walks and walks until she reaches a house and collapses at the doorstep. The family inside helps her recover. She introduces herself as Jane Elliott and gives a short, non-specific version of her life. St. John, that's spelled St. John, Diana, and Mary Rivers used to be wealthy, but their father lost all their money. St. John is a clergyman, and the sisters are going to be governesses like Jane. The girls become friends quickly, but Jane's more cautious with St. John. He's very handsome, but cold and unhappy. St. John offers her a job as teachers of the girls' school in town. Jane accepts. It's hard but useful work. She feels good about what she's doing, but still dreams of Rochester. St. John also has an ex he wants to forget. His goal in life is to become a missionary, and his ex is a good person, but somewhat shallow. Way harsh, St. John. He just knows he'll regret it if he marries her. One day, St. John narrates a story to Jane. 20 years ago, a poor guy gets married to a rich man's daughter and her family disowns her. They die but leave a daughter who's taken in by the man's sister, a Mrs. Reed. He proceeds to summarize Jane's life to her, including the affair with Mr. Rochester. He knows who she is because he saw her real name written down on one of her papers. People are looking for her because she's inherited £20,000 from an uncle who happens to be St. John's uncle as well. His full name is St. John Eyre Rivers, and she's their long-lost cousin. Jane's overjoyed. She has family now. She splits the fortune so that Diana and Mary won't have to work anymore, and St. John has money to fulfill his dreams. Then, St. John starts acting weird and controlling. It's not long before he asks Jane to go to India with him. He thinks she'll be the perfect wife for a missionary. Jane says no because he doesn't love her. So for a week, St. John keeps pressuring her. He argues that it's God's will, and this almost convinces Jane when suddenly, out of thin air, she hears Rochester's voice calling to her. She calls back and looks around, but he's not there. Jane travels to Thornfield to figure out what's going on. When she arrives, she finds the house burned down to ruins. Shocked, Jane goes to the inn in town and asks what happened. Apparently, Bertha started a fire in the middle of the night. Rochester saved the servants, but Bertha jumped off a wall before he could rescue her. The wall collapsed and Rochester lost his hand and his eyesight. Jane asks where she can find Rochester now and goes to him right away. When she arrives at one of his other houses, she watches him for a bit and thinks he looks like a wild beast. He wasn't handsome to begin with, but he really let himself go. She introduces herself to the servants and brings Rochester his food in their stead. When she enters the room, his dog recognizes her and jumps up to greet her. Rochester demands to know who's there. He reaches out and Jane touches his hand. He knows her fingers and asks if it's Jane. His Jane, and not a dream sent to torment him. Jane tells him all about her inheritance and he decides that she is real because he can't imagine dreaming about something as boring and practical as money. Really, dude? I do. Anyway, Rochester is depressed and self-pitying, so Jane thinks of a way to get him to snap out of it. The next day, she talks about the rivers and, St. John especially, Rochester gets more and more jealous until Jane admits that she's teasing him, just like how he teased her with Blanche. In fact, she's still in love with him if that's okay. Rochester says he's crippled and ruined and not the man he used to be. Will she marry him anyway? Spoiler, Jane says yes. Rochester also tells Jane that around 4 days ago, he called out to her 3 times and thought he heard her call back. He thinks that their spirits met somehow and that's what led Jane back to him.
Reader, I married him. A quiet wedding we had. He and I, the parson and clerk, were alone present. When we got back from church, I went into the kitchen of the manor house, where Mary was cooking the dinner, and John cleaning the knives, and I said, "Mary, I have been married to Mr. Rochester this morning."
Older Jane, who is writing the book, the full title, by the way, is Jane Eyre, an Autobiography, gives the readers a quick epilogue. Jane writes to the Rivers and tells them about the wedding. The sisters are happy for her, but St. John doesn't write back for 6 months. The sisters eventually get married and St. John goes off to India unmarried and his letters imply that he's going to die there alone. Adele goes to boarding school because Jane doesn't have the time to be both teacher and caretaker, wife, to Mr. Rochester. It takes a while to find the right school, but it seems to have a positive effect on Adele. The Jane telling the story has been married to Rochester for 10 years. He gets his sight back after 2 years of marriage. They have a son and live happily ever after. Being mentally ill was not so great during the Victorian era. It's not so great now, but back then it was extra sucky. You'd be thrown into a mental asylum or madhouse. The 19th century version of a psychiatric hospital, which were not known for being patient-friendly. In fact, they were more like prisons. Patients were chained and tortured, stuffed in dirty, crowded rooms, and barely fed. So, on one hand, at least Rochester kept his wife in a relatively comfortable room with a caregiver. On the other hand, he still kept her hidden in the attic and then tried to commit bigamy while gaslighting his young side piece, and an employee at that, into thinking that it's all in her head. Can't stress this enough, but ladies, please, don't find you a man like this. Okay? Charlotte Bronte's treatment of Bertha wasn't that great either. She often described her like an animal, calling her it. It was also a bit racist since it's implied that Bertha is of mixed race. Even though Jane stands up for Bertha, calling Rochester cruel because, quote-unquote, she cannot help being mad, is kind of hard to take seriously when Bronte's text itself is equally as harsh as Rochester. It was so unfair that in 1966, writer John Rhys wrote a prequel of sorts told from the point of view of Bertha. It's called Wide Sargasso Sea, if you want to check it out. In it, she points out that maybe we shouldn't be so quick to take Rochester's word for it. Historically speaking, men have accused women of being crazy or hysterical just to have an excuse to get rid of them. Medicine and psychiatry was often used to control difficult women. I don't even have to go as far back as the Victorian era to find an example of this. May I present to you? Exhibit A. Britney Jean Spears. Now, if you don't know who she is, how very dare you? Do not disrespect my queen like that. But okay, fine. Let me explain. In 1999, at the young age of 17, Britney Spears became a pop star and global phenomenon. She had best-selling albums, scandalous relationships, and even more scandalous breakups. She kissed Madonna, made a flop movie, got married, got a divorce. Oh, and in 2007, she had a very public mental breakdown. After multiple incidents and 2 hospitalizations, her father petitioned the court to make him her guardian for 1 year while she tries to get her act together. The year passed and Britney seemed to be getting better. She guested on a hit TV show and started promoting her new album. But her father went to the courts again to make his conservatorship permanent. Allegedly, Britney had developed early-onset dementia. In her 20s. Even more shocking, his request was granted. In 12 years, Britney couldn't make any decisions about her life or career without permission from her father. Legally speaking, she can't drive a car on her own, or vote, or have equal custody of her children. But apparently she's fine enough to keep working. Since then, she's released multiple albums, toured worldwide, and even had a Las Vegas residency. Sounds legit. Her father stepped down from his duties in 2019 and she was assigned a temporary guardian. But just this week, her conservatorship was extended to February 2021. Now, I don't want to speculate on Britney's current mental state, but it's her basic human right to live her life the way she wants to. And we wish her all the best because we don't want her to become another mad woman in the attic like Bertha. Hashtag Free Britney. And there we have it. Thanks for listening, you guys. I hope I made Jane Eyre a little bit easier to digest. I'm Gabby, and you can find me at Gabby Pascual-Vox on Instagram and Twitter, or you can use the hashtag Digestibles Podcast. Special thanks to Merrick for providing the narrations and Jazz for composing our theme music. And shout out to our listeners from Germany, Czech Republic, and the Netherlands. Really cool that you guys are tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Anyway, tune in next week for our next episode. See ya! Digestibles is part of Connect, a podcast network, bringing together entertaining stories to spark your imagination. For more awesome content, follow us on social media @Connect Podcasts.